Your expert is Andrew R. Wilson, a professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College, an award-winning professor and an expert in both military history and strategic theory. He has lectured around the world on a variety of topics, including Sun Tzu's The Art of War. The views expressed in this course are those of the professor and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the teaching company LLC, the U.S. Naval War College, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Let's start with a question. What do former Secretary of State Colin Powell, legendary football coach Bill Belichick, fictional mobster Tony Soprano, and hip-hop impresario The RZA all have in common? Well, they're all fans of Sun Tzu's Art of War. But it doesn't stop there. The Art of War appears in business school curricula, in advertising, and across American pop culture, especially in movies and television. From Oliver Stone's Wall Street to my favorite, The Simpsons. Now, my specialties include Chinese strategic thought, and particularly the Art of War. Over my career, I've read numerous different translations and gone word for word through the original text in classical Chinese. Obviously, I'm fascinated by this book. Even so, it always surprises me just how popular it is and how frequently it's invoked in everything from military strategy to sports and business. There's even one book applying the Art of War to romance. So almost everyone has heard of the Art of War, millions have read it, and many people claim its immediate relevance to their daily lives. In fact, the eminent British military theorist, Basil Littleheart, described the Art of War as having an eternal freshness, a quality that transcended all time and historical context. We'll be spending a lot of time on that eternal freshness. We'll examine cases of success and failure in war, politics, in business, and in life. And we'll see how the principles of the Art of War have been applied and misapplied in all these areas, right down to the present day. But before we jump into contemporary examples, let's first orient ourselves to the historical context in which the book was written. Because while the Art of War definitely has a timeless appeal, it's still a product of a unique time and place. We need to learn a few things about that time and place if you want to truly understand this timeless and universal classic. And that's what we'll be doing in this and our two subsequent lectures. Now, I'm not saying that you need an encyclopedic knowledge of ancient China to understand this book. In fact, some of my best insights into the Art of War have come from students and colleagues who aren't experts in this field. What I am saying, however, is that a little knowledge of the tectonic shifts taking place at the time this book appeared will make you a better educated consumer of its theoretical and practical content. That'll also help you to appreciate that this book is far more than a contemporary pop culture fad. It's a significant landmark in the history of strategic thought. But before I get into that, let me reveal a couple of secrets. The first is that the name of this book is not actually The Art of War. Rather, Sun Tzu Bing Fa, the title, as pronounced in modern Mandarin, is more accurately translated as Sun, which is a surname, followed by Tzu, the master, Bing, military, and Fa, method. Master Sun's military methods. So, who is this Master Sun? He's, we believe he was a Chinese general whose proper name was Sun Wu, and he purportedly lived at the end of the 6th century BCE. But here's the second secret. Sun Wu didn't write this book. Instead, what's happening is that an anonymous 4th century author, or group of authors, is attributing this text to an eponymous master. That master lived at a pivotal moment in history. The master, with the authority granted by antiquity, is then free to argue that their readers need to radically rethink their military methods. But the fact that Sun Wu wasn't the author shouldn't cause you to reject this book outright. Don't reject the book's value and insight. Rather, appropriating Sun Wu's military credentials was crucial to the argument that this book is trying to make. And we'll see why a little later in this lecture. So now that I've shared those two secrets, I should probably make one more note. During these lectures, I may sometimes refer to as the art of war as simply the Sunzi or just Sunzi. This is academic shorthand, but there's no mystery in it, right? If you hear me say the Sunzi or Sunzi, they're just other ways of saying the art of war. So to recap, Sunzi Bingfa, which you can still call the art of war, was composed sometime toward the end of the 4th century BCE. But the wisdom in its pages is attributed to Sun Wu, who lived 2 centuries earlier, at the end of the 6th century. And we can't trace the maxims in the art of war directly to some historical person, Sun Wu, but the supposed life and martial feats of General Sun, the man that we call Master Sun, comprised the backstory of this classic of strategic thought. But this backstory isn't just about Sun Wu, it's also about the transformation of society, of the political systems, and the transformation of war and warfare in ancient China. To understand these transformations, we need to go back even further than the biography of Sun Wu, all the way back to the 8th century BCE. At that time, China was ruled by a dynasty called the Zhou, spelled Z-H-O-U in pinyin, Zhou. But in fact, the Chinese political order was at that time more of a feudal confederation. The Zhou kings had tremendous ritual and cultural importance, in other words, soft power, but they didn't have much military or economic power. That hard power, however, tended to concentrate in the hands of rulers of the Zhou's allies, right? Allied states surrounding the Zhou heartland. But even those states tended to be feudal confederations themselves. For example, a state might be ruled nominally by a duke, a gong, but under him there could be dozens of virtually independent aristocratic clans. What that did was limit each state's individual power because the duke doesn't actually rule the entire territory. It also limits the war-making capacity of these dukedoms. Think about it this way. I'm the Duke of New Jersey. I've decided to declare war on New York. So if I'm going to win, I need to persuade the barons of Bergen and Burlington, the marquises of Morris, Monmouth, Mercer, and Middlesex, and the counts of Cumberland, Cape May, and Camden to show up with their personal armies on the appointed day. And even if they do show up, they're going to be bringing their own personal ambitions and family vendettas to the battlefield. Right? The Baron of Bergen might be far more interested in seeking out his blood enemy, the Count of Cattaraugus, New York, right? Fighting him instead of obeying my orders, even though I'm his duke. The Duke of New York will face similar problems. That's war in 8th century BCE China. 2 or more of these confederations line up against each other, but they could only campaign in certain seasons when the weather was good and the ground was dry. The battles themselves could be highly ritualized to start with, but they'd be chaotic almost instantly. Before the battle, they'd read omens and shout elaborate challenges at their foes and proclaim sacred justifications for going to war. And the combat would generally be between armies centered around chariot-mounted aristocrats. Those battles might involve a few thousand men total. And yet, war, while relatively small in scale, was absolutely central to the Chinese aristocracy's identity. We'll see later that the battlefield was an almost holy place where you spilled your enemy's blood and honored your ancestors. Battle was about ritual, glory, and vengeance. But those political and military conditions began to change in the middle of the 7th century BCE. Most notably in the northern state of Qi, Qi, pronounced Qi. Qi's rulers were famous for their martial prowess and had regularly been called upon to defend the Zhou's northern frontiers. That high military readiness had in turn driven institutional innovations that allowed Qi to tap into its population's strategic potential. For one, the dukes of Qi either bought out or eliminated the lower aristocratic fiefdoms. That transformed Qi from a loose confederation into a unified state. Qi also created a bureaucracy that could systematically collect taxes and draft soldiers. And finally, Qi established a military tradition that emphasized a commander's talent over their noble pedigree. In the course of a generation, Qi became one of the dominant states in ancient China. Its ruler was granted the title of Ba, or hegemon, a kind of supreme warlord, a peace enforcer within the Chinese cultural sphere. But transformation can migrate. As other Chinese states started to adopt these innovations from Qi, we start to see better bureaucratic and military organization. We also see warfare increase in scale, breadth, lethality, and cost. The conventional wisdom has it that Sun Wu, the general to whom the art of war is attributed, was born and raised in Qi. So that would have been in the 6th century BCE, and as a result, he would have been steeped in Qi's bureaucratic and military reforms. But by Sun Wu's time, Qi was in relative decline, and its experts were going abroad looking for other rulers who might adopt their lessons. That's how Sun Wu comes to the court of King He Lu, the ruler of a southern state called Wu. We can tell already that King He Lu is ambitious. He calls himself king. Up to this point, there had only been one Zhou king, but some rulers are starting to claim equality with and potentially considering supplanting the Zhou. He Lu is one of those rulers, but so is the king of his western neighbor, Chu. So there's a struggle for dominance in southern China between Wu and Chu. It's in this context that General Sun Wu comes to the attention of King He Lu. Like many prospective employees, Sun Wu has an interview, and it's a truly memorable one. And I've actually been to the exact spot where this supposedly happened. In the Wu audience chamber, the king challenges Sun Wu to prove that he can turn anyone, even a woman, into a soldier. Sun Wu says yes, and sets up a demonstration with a group of the king's concubines. When the women giggle instead of obeying orders, Sun Wu has the 2 senior concubines decapitated, after which the rest fall into line and obey perfectly. So with one stroke, Sun Wu demonstrates the very serious business of military discipline and the new realities of mass warfare, where drill and obedience are everything. Chilled but convinced, He Lu gives Sun Wu command of one of his armies. The general then goes on to train and equip that force of about 30,000 men in the methods of Qi. In the war that followed against the state of Chu, the general used that modest force to harass, wear down, and ultimately defeat Chu's much larger armies. Sun Wu was therefore instrumental in the meteoric rise of Wu. In fact, Chu's defeat made King He Lu hegemon, or Ba. Over time, however, Sun Wu grew disillusioned with Wu's rulers and resigned his commission. Absent General Sun, Wu was gradually worn down in a series of wars, until it was finally wiped out by the same foe that Sun Wu had defeated a generation before. At this point, Wu's utter destruction by a resurgent Chu ushered in a new age of cutthroat competition between the remaining Chinese states. That, in turn, accelerated the transformation of warfare. In the Warring States period, which spans the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE, we see ever larger and better organized states. By the 4th century, only 7 massive states remained. That's when the Sun Tzu was written, around 330 or 320 BCE. Keep this in mind. The art of war was composed in a context of multiple states, large and lethal enough to compete for control of all of China. And we have every reason to believe that each warring state could raise and field armies in the hundreds of thousands. You've probably seen images of China's famous terracotta warriors, this 8,000-man army for the afterlife, which guards the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, China's first emperor, the king who unified China in the late 3rd century. That terracotta army is a graphic reminder of the centrality of war, the scale of the military, and of the bureaucratic sophistication of ancient China's warring states. The art of war gives us even more precise insight into this transformed situation. Military operations, Chapter 2 begins, generally require 1,000 combat chariots, 1,000 transport wagons, and arms and armor for 100,000 soldiers. All told, those expenses amounted to about 1,000 gold pieces a day. That would have been about 60% of a warring state's revenue. War had become big business. So far we've been tracing the dramatic changes that occurred in ancient China between the 8th and 4th centuries BCE. Transformations in the scale, scope, and expense of war. Huge armies, increasingly armed with standardized weapons. Armies requiring huge logistical support systems. The problem was that despite all these radical changes, old notions about command and the traditional emphases on personal valor and blood vendetta still prevailed. Anachronistic notions about the purpose of war, tied to the incredible new means to wage war, that's a truly dangerous combination. Think back to the story of Wu. Sun Wu provides King Helu with the military methods that dramatically increase Wu's power, and he also provides the leadership to use that military effectively. In Sun Wu's hands, Wu's military was the guarantor of the state's power and prosperity. But with lesser leaders at the helm, leaders bent on revenge and personal glory, that military was ground down and Wu ultimately destroyed. That's why the very first line of The Art of War reads, "The military is the greatest affair of the state, the province of life and death, the path to survival or ruin." As a result, by the 4th century BCE, China's remaining warring states confront a paradox. New and incredibly lethal military capabilities, but dangerously anachronistic notions about what militaries are for and how they should be used. The Art of War confronts that paradox head on. It offers a new way of thinking about military command and about strategy. A way of thinking appropriate to the military and political realities of its time. And the authors of the Sun Tzu are trying to sell this new model to the rulers of the states contending for ultimate hegemony in 4th century China. But that creates another problem. The Art of War is an argument for military command based on merit, not birth. And it's extremely critical of those anachronistic notions about what war is all about. In other words, it argues that you should only use the military to generate tangible benefits for the state, not in the pursuit of glory or vengeance. But the people most likely to think in old-fashioned ways about war are the hereditary rulers of the warring states themselves. That's why The Art of War tells us 100 victories in 100 battles is not the supreme excellence. To reject battle and yet force the submission of the enemy's troops is the supreme excellence. In other words, the acme of skill is to win without fighting. To a warring state's king, war, and especially combat, were ends in themselves, where the Sun Tzu views them as just a means to a larger end. To borrow a phrase from contemporary business, our authors are change agents, trying to transform attitudes to optimize utility. But every change agent knows transformation can be a hard sell, and sometimes rhetorical extremes are necessary. That's why the structure of the Sun Tzu alternates between the relentlessly methodical and the boldly provocative. It hammers home the point that thinking about the nature and purpose of war has not caught up with the new realities of warfare. And it provocatively tells its audience, those aristocratic rulers themselves, that they are a big part of the problem. This role as change agent puts our authors in the company of the other great strategic thinkers, such as Machiavelli and Karl von Clausewitz, as well as great business leaders from Henry Ford to Jeff Bezos. People who are trying to change attitudes and processes to better fit their own radically changed and changing circumstances. The change that The Art of War is pushing is based on two interrelated arguments. The first is that the sole purpose for the military's existence and employment is to increase the state's wealth and power. Simply put, it's about profit. And I quote, "If it does not profit the state, do not use the military." The second argument is that the general must have complete autonomy. As The Art of War puts it, The ruler has able generals and who does not interfere in their affairs will be victorious. These two core arguments are amplified when we understand the backstory about Qi, the transformation of warfare, and Wu's rise and fall. Knowing that backstory adds layers of depth, complexity, and context to our reading of this book. Of course, anybody reading The Art of War in ancient China would have known the backstory. They would have recalled the tragedy of Wu. But there's something of an historical bait and switch at work here. That adds shock value. Traditionally, Wu's rise and fall was treated as a cautionary morality tale. Ambition and vengeance get the better of Wu's rulers, and this once great power is exterminated. Our authors, however, by attributing the art of war to General Sun, a character in the drama of Wu, are shifting the focus from morality to the military. And that shift from the moral to the martial is even more pronounced because it's attributed to Master Sun. Not just Sun Wu, master. And master is an incredibly loaded term. Initially, master, the term is zi, was a low-level aristocrat. It was the Confucians, led by Kung Fu Zi, Master Kung Fu, whom we call Confucius, who first used zi to claim equality with the hereditary nobility. This equality was based on their learning, not on their birth. Soon, other schools, like the Taoists, were calling their leading lights Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. But until the 4th century, master was reserved for moralists and philosophers. The Art of War is the first book to claim that military affairs, the Bingfa, are the fit topic for a master. So, in the same way that the early Confucians claimed master status to stand equal with the hereditary nobility, here we have a military expert trying to stand equal with the great moral philosophers. But the similarity between those early masters' moral teachings and Master Sun's hard-nosed realism ends there. In fact, the Sun Tzu's claims might be even more ambitious. It describes the military as the state's greatest affair, supplanting traditional considerations like sacred rituals and the ruler's moral cultivation. It also helps that Sun Wu lived at the same time as Confucius. This is a culture where the older the source is, the more legitimacy it has. That's how this elaborate tale about Sun Wu at the court of Helu gets started. A master, like a superhero, needs an origin story. In our next 2 lectures, we'll be coming back to that origin story and to the transformations taking place in ancient China. The changes in attitudes that our authors are trying to drive. For now, let's turn our attention to the structure and content of the Sun Tzu by picking up a copy and giving it a once-over. The first thing you notice is its brevity. The original is fewer than 7,000 Chinese characters. To put that in perspective, I could recite the whole thing in just 2 of these lectures. If your translation has a little more heft than most of them do, that's because the press has added introductory essays, glossaries, maps, and images. But even in English translation, the core text is still very, very lean. The standard version comprises 13 chapters attributed to Master Sun, each chapter beginning with the line, Master Sun said. And always remember why it is so controversial to call Sun Wu a master. But given that they come from a master, many maxims in the text appear like unassailable truths, free from extensive supporting analysis or reinforcing historical examples. In addition, the Sun Tzu is composed in an extremely terse style, with individual passages often reading like discrete pearls of wisdom, easily divorced from the rest of the text. For example, and I quote, "The supreme excellence is to achieve victory without resort to battle." Well, that might sound great, but when taken out of both historical and textual context, a statement like that is about as useful as telling a rookie investor on Wall Street to buy low and sell high. So many versions of the Sun Tzu will also intersperse commentaries with the original text, filling in with examples or explanations where the original simply states some maxim. That can be either helpful or a formula for misinterpretation. In the first place, the original offers little in the way of context or concrete examples. So later commentators add examples of their own choosing. That's not always for the better. The commentaries can also disrupt the flow and obscure the book's logical coherence. That's why we need to be careful when reading this book. When you do it, try to read it as a coherent manifesto. Watch for how the arguments build and for how the language is consistent and purposeful. My approach when reading and teaching this book is to pay particular attention to how the authors define and use specific terms. Whenever I come across one of those particular terms, maybe later in the book, I think of it as a hyperlink. If you click on it, it will take you back to the original definition. Paying attention to those definitions is also crucial because classical Chinese, as in many languages, in that language, words can have many different meanings. You need to make sure to understand which meaning is applicable at that particular moment in the book. For example, the term benevolence, pronounced ren in Chinese. That term appears only twice in The Art of War, so this is an easy one. Benevolence is a core concept in ancient Chinese philosophy, especially in Confucianism. For Confucians, its meaning is very close to our own: kindness and charity, putting the interests of others before your own, essentially the golden rule. So when the Sun Tzu tells us that benevolence is one of the 5 virtues of the general, along with wisdom, sincerity, courage, and discipline, we might default to reading that term from a Confucian point of view. In fact, I think Confucius would have been horrified by this book and how that term is used. Why? Well, the only other place where benevolence appears in the book is in chapter 13, the chapter that covers the use of spies. There, the utmost in benevolence is defined as the general's willingness to pay top dollar to spies, top dollar to traitors in the enemy's camp, the scum of the earth, paying them for actionable intelligence. That's a radically different kind of benevolence from what the Confucians had in mind. So you need to stay attuned to definitions, especially how they're laid out in chapter 1. And we'll be dedicating all of lecture 4 to that seminal chapter, which lists the critical calculations that must be made prior to war, what Sun Tzu refers to as knowing the enemy, knowing ourselves, knowing the weather, knowing the terrain. From the very start, therefore, we see an emphasis not on heroics, but on intellect and analysis. Those are the qualities necessary to train and employ a transformed military. So turning from there to the rest of the 13 chapters in the Sun Tzu, chapter 2 lays out the costs and dangers of mobilizing a state for war. That's where we're alerted to the risks of getting bogged down in protracted military operations. Remember what happened to the kingdom of Wu. But we need to ask if protraction is always bad, right? After all, George Washington employed a Fabian strategy. Fabian requires protraction. But remember the historical context. 2 ancient Chinese warring states are like heavyweight boxers. They've pummeled each other for 15 rounds. They won't have the strength to defend themselves if a third boxer, i.e. another Chinese state, jumps into the ring. Actually, that was exactly Washington's logic. If he could drag the war out until the French could intervene decisively. Chapter 3, moving on, lays out a continuum from the most to the least efficient strategies, starting with attacking the enemy's strategy itself, then attacking their alliances, attacking their armies, and last, attacking their walled cities. It's interesting. Attacking the enemy's army comes third on this list. In other words, resorting to combat, which many consider the most decisive course of action in war, represents a failure of strategic imagination. But let's remember, war in 4th century China was radically different than it had been in the 8th century. And in war, as in business, change requires adaptation. Chapters 4 through 11 explore the essence of military doctrine and operations. In these chapters, we're treated to the Sun Tzu commander's nearly supernatural skills in organizing troops, maneuvering the army, exploiting terrain and weather, gathering intelligence, deploying various formations, and manipulating their opponents into self-defeating behavior. We'll be spending time on these skills in lectures 5 through 7. In those lectures, we'll also consider Chapter 12's delightfully dispassionate discussion of how and when to set fire to things and to people. And then finally, Chapter 13. That's the chapter that explains how this near total mastery of the strategic environment is possible through the deft use of spies, the gathering, processing, and exploitation of information. We'll discuss those topics at length in Lecture 8. So the art of war is not a random jumble of maxims. It's a coherent manifesto aimed to revolutionize ancient Chinese attitudes towards war and strategic leadership, something that it can still do today. And whereas ancient China's aristocrats felt they were born to command, a Sun Tzu general earns their command based on their intellect and complete mastery of these new military methods, the Bingfa. But before we turn to an in-depth examination of the Sun Tzu's contents, we're going to start by peeling back the layers of myth-making that surround the legendary Master Sun and explore further the revolutionary changes transforming statecraft and warfare in ancient China. Transformations that drove our authors to compose this revolutionary manifesto, one that anticipated the political and military revolutions of the modern era. It's these characteristics that convinced Basil Littleheart that the art of war was essentially timeless. So look around at other contemporary and historical transformations. Things like the ongoing artificial intelligence revolution. Who's going to survive? Who's going to thrive? Who's going to fail? Well, those who survive and thrive, well, it's certainly not people like the ancient Chinese aristocracy. Those folks clinging to dangerously outmoded ideas about strategy and leadership. I'll see you next time.